They called her the White Angel, the safest ship ever built. But one quiet morning in 1916, a single underwater explosion silenced her forever. For decades, she was lost to the Aegean Sea, until Jacques Cousteau found her and called her the most beautiful wreck I've ever seen. A century later, she still sleeps there, perfectly preserved, almost alive, and untouched. But her beauty hides something no one talks about. Because the same ocean that keeps her intact also keeps her trapped. And to understand why the world's most advanced ship never returned to the surface, we have to go back to where her story began. Britannic was built as the Great Correction. The ship that would prove human error could be engineered out of existence. After her sister's loss, White Star Line poured everything they'd learned into her design. She wasn't just another luxury liner. She was meant to be the redemption of the Age of Steel. Every inch of her was reimagined for safety. Beneath her graceful curves lay double hull plating, an armored layer running the length of her body. Her watertight bulkhead soared higher than Titanic's, dividing the ship into sealed chambers meant to hold off flooding even if multiple compartments were breached. Along both sides of her decks, banks of lifeboats waited, enough to carry every person aboard. Britannic was supposed to be the ship that finally outsmarted disaster. When she was launched in early 1914, optimism floated with her. She was the biggest and most technically advanced ocean liner ever built, a statement of confidence that tragedy could be prevented by design. But before she could begin her career as a civilian liner, the world itself changed course. War broke out, and the British Admiralty requisitioned her before she ever carried a paying passenger. Her grand interiors, still smelling of new paint and varnish, were stripped, disinfected, and repurposed for war. Chandeliers came down, stretchers went up. The floating palace became His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic. Even in her new form, she carried the same promise, the safest ship afloat, now serving as a lifeline for the wounded. She moved through the Aegean Sea, white-painted, with massive red crosses emblazoned along her hull to mark her as a vessel of mercy. For a time, the engineer's faith seemed justified. Her reinforced body shrugged off smaller shocks and rough seas. To the crew, she felt unbreakable. That illusion shattered on November 21, 1916. As she steamed through the Key Channel off Greece, a German mine detonated beneath her forward compartments. The blast ripped through the lower decks and triggered flooding faster than any watertight door could contain. Captain Charles Bartlett ordered the ship toward the nearby shore in a desperate attempt to beach her, but the damage was already too severe. 55 minutes after the explosion, Britannic slipped beneath the surface, less than half the time it took for Titanic to die. Out of more than 1,000 people on board, 30 were lost. By the grim arithmetic of maritime disaster, that was a triumph. Her improved design and abundant lifeboats had worked. Yet her strength hadn't saved her. Only her passengers. The Britannic's story ends not in failure, but in paradox. The ship built to outlive tragedy proved that even the best design can't outrun a new kind of threat. And down there, where her white hull still rests, the beauty of what remains tells a different side of her promise. Nearly 60 years passed before anyone saw her again. In 1975, Jacques Cousteau and his crew aboard the Calypso found the Britannic resting quietly on the seafloor of the Aegean Sea, and what they saw stunned them. Cousteau called her the most beautiful wreck I've ever seen. The phrase stuck because it captured something no one expected, a shipwreck that looked alive. The Britannic lies only about 400 feet below the surface, shallow enough for sunlight to reach her decks. That light turns the wreck into something ethereal. Beams slide through open portholes and cut across corridors once lined with hospital beds. Divers describe porcelain sinks still clinging to walls, patterned tiles caught in place, and long shadows drifting through her interior. It's not darkness that defines her resting place, but a golden haze, as if the sea itself decided to preserve her mid-breath. Unlike Titanic, entombed 2.5 miles down in total blackness, Britannic lives in clear, temperate water. The Aegean's gentle currents sweep through her passageways, washing away silt but leaving the metal untouched. Coral and small colonies of marine life have anchored themselves to her hull, forming a living skin that shields the steel underneath. Tiny fish dart through the windows, reflecting the light like drifting sparks. Every detail that remains, the railing curves, the stair outlines, even glass bottles and stretchers half buried in sand, adds to the illusion that the ship could one day rise unchanged. That illusion has always tempted people. Her shallow depth makes her feel attainable, visible, almost cooperative. You could stand on a modern dive platform and imagine cranes, cables, air bladders, a whole operation to lift her back into the sun. She looks ready, but it's an illusion built on balance. What preserves her is also what binds her to the seabed. The weight of the water, the pressure pressing evenly on every plate, holds her together. Because she lies on her starboard side, the sunlight pours straight into her open decks, tracing a cathedral-like glow through the body of the ship. Divers talk about the sense of entering a vast, silent chamber rather than a ruin. There's beauty in that stillness, a tranquility that doesn't belong to the world above. Cameras capture it easily. The water's clarity tricks the eye into believing she's whole. But the perfection you see in the footage is fragile science. Remove her from this environment and the protective coral flakes away, the pressure equalizing her structure disappears, and oxygen begins the slow, unstoppable attack on her steel. Britannic's grace depends entirely on where she is. The same water that swallowed her now braces her against collapse. And that leads to the real question. If she lies so close to sunlight, what would it actually take to bring her back? It turns out the answer isn't about willpower or machinery, it's physics, chemistry, and respect. The Britannic can never rise again, not because we lack the tools, but because everything that keeps her intact depends on staying where she is. She may lie nearer to sunlight than her famous sister, but she's still more than 880 feet of steel stretched along the seafloor, a massive structure weighing nearly 50,000 tons. Her bow is crushed against the seabed, and much of her hull rests half buried in mud that tightens its grip each year. Pulling that free wouldn't be a lift. It would be a struggle against gravity, suction, and a century of slow entombment. Some picture rows of cranes or giant lift balloons carrying her upward, but even with modern engineering, the idea breaks apart quickly. Dozens of perfectly synchronized lifts would be needed, each immense enough to support thousands of tons, and even then, one uneven strain could tear the hull in half before it broke the surface. The seabed bears her weight evenly. Open air would wrench her apart. People often compare the idea to the raising of the Costa Concordia, but the two situations couldn't be more different. The Concordia, though larger, was only half underwater and intact for a short time. Britannic, on the other hand, has spent over 100 years under pressure and chemical equilibrium. Moving her would undo that delicate balance in moments. And then there's the invisible threat, oxygen. Her steel has lived sealed in salt and cold for generations. The instant it meets open air, corrosion would race through every plate and rivet. Within days, the ship's skin would turn brittle. Within weeks, she'd start to crumble. Any recovery would turn preservation into demolition. Even if that risk were ignored, there's the question of authenticity. Much of what once gave the Britannic her spirit, the wooden wheelhouse, interior decor, furniture, has already vanished. To restore her would mean rebuilding from scratch, layering replicas over a fragile hull, until what surfaced wasn't preservation at all, but recreation, a model, not a memory. And behind the technical impossibility stands a moral wall. 30 people went down with her, and the British government officially designated the site a protected war grave in 2003. Divers who reach it treat the wreck with reverence, aware that every corridor doubles as a memorial. Raising her would mean dismantling a graveyard to chase an image of beauty that only the sea can hold. So Britannic remains where she fell, sustained by water that presses, seals, and cares for her better than air ever could. The sea guards her now, not as a ruin, but as something preserved by surrender, quiet, unmoving, and strangely alive. Now the water does what no dock or museum ever could. The sea that saves her keeps the White Angel suspended in a single, unbroken moment between war and peace. Down there, light drifts gently through the wreck, and the quiet feels closer to a chapel than a grave. Divers move with care, mindful not to disturb that stillness, a kind of reverence that doesn't need rules. Britannic holds the same irony she was born from. Built to defy water, she survives only by yielding to it. Maybe that's her real legacy, a reminder that some beauty endures because it can't be claimed. So what do you think? Should the White Angel and ships like her stay where time chose to keep them, or should we try to bring them home? Write your answer in the comments.
For over a century, people have wondered, could the Titanic ever rise again? Imagine, about 2 miles down in the North Atlantic, the great ship resting in silence, split apart on the sea floor. At first glance, it seems like only a question of engineering, a problem waiting for a practical solution. We'll quietly look at why law and respect, deep-sea decay and sheer cost keep the ship where it lies. Let's take a quiet look at how, across time, people have still tried to imagine ways of bringing her back. In the years just after the disaster, the idea of raising the Titanic began to surface almost immediately. By 1912, families of first-class passengers such as John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and George Widener were quietly exploring whether salvage might be possible. Their interest was not only in the grandeur of the ship itself, but also in the hope of retrieving belongings or keepsakes tied to those they had lost. They reached out to the Merritt and Chapman Derrick and Wrecking Company, one of the most capable firms of the time, to ask if recovery was within reach. The answer was firm. With the technology then available, the plan was impossible. Even so, the raw grief of the era sparked ambitious ideas. Some thought the wreck could be pulled to the surface through sheer mechanical force. In 1914, a proposal appeared describing the use of massive electromagnets lowered from above, devices that would attach themselves to Titanic's steel hull. Winches mounted on surface ships would then pull, as if tugging the vessel straight out of the seabed. While simple in theory, the plan belonged more to science fiction than real engineering. The magnets did not exist at the scale required, and the immense pressure of the deep ocean was completely underestimated. Alongside such engineering dreams, some desperate suggestions briefly appeared. A few writers speculated about blasting away surrounding seabed with explosives to release the ship. These thoughts were short-lived and never acted upon, but they reveal the level of longing people felt in those early years, and how imagination often leapt ahead of practicality. Other schemes took a different direction, embracing the principle of buoyancy rather than brute strength. If the ship could not be pulled, perhaps it could be floated. Engineers and amateur inventors alike drew up plans to send down huge containers filled with air or gas, fastening them along Titanic's hull until the ship itself rose like a cork through water. The difficulty was staggering. Hundreds of such tanks would have been required, each lowered by cable through nearly 2 miles of shifting currents. The sheer weight and logistics were far beyond what was possible in an age without modern submersibles or deep-sea robotics. By the mid-20th century, the more imaginative ideas for raising Titanic became even more elaborate, though the forces at play nearly 4 kilometers down told a different story. At that depth, every inch of the wreck lies under about 6,000 pounds of pressure, like a small car pressing down on a single square inch. This reality framed both the dreams that continued to appear and the reasons they faded. One of the most famous suggestions was to fill the ship with millions of ping-pong balls. Since they float, the thinking went, they could lift Titanic back to the surface. Yet under such immense pressure, any ordinary plastic ball would simply implode long before reaching the wreck. Others imagined a stranger version of buoyancy by packing the ship with Vaseline. While technically lighter than water, the vision ignored the impossibility of lowering enormous barrels to nearly 13,000 feet and the fact that cold and pressure would alter the material itself. Some proposals reached for more creative approaches. Designers pictured Titanic packed with pressure-resistant glass spheres, each capable of holding air and creating lift. But the scale was staggering. Millions of units had to be manufactured, shipped, and placed. By the time cost estimates appeared, they approached hundreds of millions of dollars, even in mid-century values, rendering the concept little more than a sketch on paper. One of the boldest schemes suggested encasing the ship in ice, by pouring liquid nitrogen over its hull, the idea being that a frozen block would float upward as an artificial iceberg. Engineers at the time calculated that 500,000 tons of liquid nitrogen would be required, along with an entire offshore liquefaction plant to supply it. The idea may have sounded poetic, but it was utterly beyond reach. Looking back, these plans may sound whimsical, bordering on fantasy, yet they also speak to the emotional need of people to imagine action, to believe that something could still be done for a ship that had come to symbolize so much loss. In that way, the ideas say as much about grief and memory as they do about engineering. The true turning point came in September 1985, when Robert Ballard's team located Titanic using the deep-sea vehicle Argo. A single boiler marked the find, and what followed ended decades of speculation. Cameras revealed a wreck ripped in two, its stern collapsed into tangled steel, its bow driven deep into the seabed. Between them stretched a debris field covering nearly 3 miles. The vision of a vessel lying intact, waiting to be lifted whole, was gone forever. What human eyes had once pictured as a preserved ship turned out instead to be a fragile grave. The steel was already breaking down into rust, the decks collapsing in places, the structure too delicate to ever move without destruction. Which brings us to a quieter question. If attempts to raise the ship proved impossible, what would it mean even today to imagine fully restoring Titanic? If someone were to announce in 2025 that Titanic could finally be raised, the idea might sound bold at first. But you know, the closer you look at the obstacles, the clearer it becomes that a genuine restoration is just not possible. 4 barriers stand out: the ship's structural fragility, its ongoing decay, its legal and memorial protection, and, well, the staggering cost of any attempt. The first challenge is the wreck's condition. Titanic's steel is no longer solid in the way people imagine. A newly identified bacterium, named Halomonas titanicae, consumes the iron and leaves behind rusticles, fragile, icicle-like growths that crumble when touched. These structures have actually replaced large portions of the ship's material strength. What once was steel plate is now brittle and hollow, making the wreck far too unstable to lift or even secure with equipment. These changes are not only invisible processes, but also clearly visible over time. One of the starkest examples is Captain Smith's quarters. In 1996, cameras still showed a recognizable bathtub, furnishings, and parts of the deckhouse around it. By 2019, those features were gone, the deck collapsing into heaps of twisted metal. What held its form one decade can quietly vanish in the next. The whole wreck is following the same pattern of collapse, leaving little to preserve. Even where recovery has been attempted, the amount of effort required underscores how impractical restoring the entire ship would be. In 1998, a 15-ton section of Titanic's hull, known as the Big Piece, was raised. Special cranes and precise planning made the lift possible, but that was only the beginning. Conservators then spent 20 months bathing the metal in sodium carbonate solution to flush out salts and stabilize what remained. That was for a single piece of wall. Scaling such treatment up to an entire ocean liner makes the idea of full recovery feel less like restoration and more like an impossibility. Then comes the legal and ethical boundary. The wreck is formally protected as a maritime memorial, recognized by both the United States and Britain under an international agreement. Article 4, Section 1 affirms that salvage for simple recovery is prohibited, with preservation given priority. NOAA has supported this position, treating the site with the respect due to a grave. RMS Titanic Incorporated does hold rights to recover artifacts, but even modest proposals have caused public concern. In 2020, when the company suggested retrieving Titanic's wireless set, the idea was condemned by many who saw it as trespassing into a resting place. And finally, there is the matter of cost. When the Costa Concordia cruise ship was salvaged off Italy after its sinking in 2012, it was far easier to access shallow water, upright position, and modern ship design. Even then, the operation cost around $800 million. Titanic lies 13,000 feet below the Atlantic, in pieces, and far less stable. Any attempt to recover it would be many times more complicated, likely costing billions. Taken together, these barriers, fragility, collapse, law, and cost, explain why 2025 cannot see a true restoration. The ship will never return whole to the surface, but its lasting presence does not depend on being lifted skyward. It rests instead in a different form of remembrance that endures quietly in the present. In thinking about what the future holds, it helps to remember the difference between preserving and restoring. The ship itself cannot be saved, but artifacts can. We saw this with the big piece, carefully lifted and stabilized over months of conservation work, or in contrast, with Captain Smith's cabin, where visible rooms seen in the 1990s had fully collapsed by 2019. These moments remind us what may be preserved and what must be left undisturbed. Perhaps the truest restoration lies in memory, keeping stories and artifacts alive with quiet respect. If you found this calming, consider subscribing for more gentle looks at curious histories.